The photo had been sitting in the archive room for decades, sealed in a brittle brown envelope that no one bothered to open. It was only when the estate's last surviving relative donated a trunk of belongings that the archivists decided to sort through the forgotten collection of wartime letters, receipts, and faded snapshots. Among them was the picture, two young friends standing arm in front of a lakeside cabin, their smiles wide, their posture relaxed, their world seemingly untouched by the horrors around them. At first glance, it radiated nothing but warmth, the kind of innocent moment families frame above fireplaces. But beneath the soft sepia tones, something felt wrong, as if the scene had been staged for an audience that didn't yet exist. When historian Mara Ellison lifted the photograph closer to the light, she felt an involuntary chill crawl up her spine. There, behind the pair, just beyond the tree line, was a darkened figure, blurred yet sharply outlined in all the ways it shouldn't be. It stood too still, too centered, almost as though it wanted to be noticed. She blinked hard, assuming it was just a trick of exposure, yet each time her eyes focused, the figure appeared a little more defined, as if leaning forward to greet her. Mara told herself it was nothing. Old photos often trapped shadows in odd ways. But the longer she stared, the more the details unsettled her. The leaves around the figure seemed bent, warped, pulled toward it by some unseen force. And the expressions of the two friends, once charming, now felt strained, like smiles held at the edge of fear. When she turned the photograph over, a line of handwriting she hadn't seen before surfaced under the dust, thin and shaky, as though the writer's hand trembled while finishing the last word, "Don't let it find you." A cold silence filled the archive room. The lights flickered once, briefly dimming the world to grey. And when they steadied again, Mara noticed something she was certain had not been there before, the faintest reflection of that same shadowy figure in the glass of the storage cabinet behind her, positioned exactly where she stood at the discovery of the photo began on a quiet afternoon when the estate's belongings were being catalogued for preservation, a task usually filled with monotony and dust. But sometimes, in the middle of such dull routine, history has a way of revealing something that was never meant to resurface. The photograph in question lay at the bottom of a weathered trunk, wrapped in yellowing tissue paper that crumbled at the slightest touch. The trunk itself smelled of mildew, old memories, and the kind of coldness that seeps from objects long untouched. No one expected anything remarkable inside, old tax records, brittle letters, a few rusted trinkets, but when the archivist pulled out the picture, it felt inexplicably heavier than paper should feel, as if it carried a story that clung to it like a second skin. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary snapshot, two friends smiling proudly, their arms linked in the camaraderie of youth. The background showed a serene lakeside cabin, the surface of the water shimmering faintly despite the photo's age. The trees framed the scene with a pleasant symmetry, and the sunlight fell in just the right place to brighten the expressions of the pair. But the longer the archivist looked, the more a sense of unease seeped in, subtle at first, like a faint whisper at the back of one's mind. The first thing that struck her wasn't the subjects, but the impeccable condition of the photograph. Photos from the 1940s rarely survived without fading, tearing, or discoloration. Yet this one appeared almost pristine, its edges sharp, its surface smooth except for one tiny ripple that looked less like damage and more like something beneath the surface trying to push outward. She rubbed her thumb gently across it, expecting dust or moisture, but the ripple did not disappear. Instead, it seemed to pulse faintly beneath the pressure, as though the image itself was not entirely still. She swallowed an inexplicable sense of dread and placed the picture under a lamp for closer inspection. As the warm light fell across its surface, the entire composition took on a strange depth. The smiles of the two friends, once warm and carefree, seemed to shift subtly, holding an odd tension at the edges of their mouths. Their eyes, bright and lively, carried a glint she couldn't quite define, something between excitement and fear. But it was the background that truly unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint why at first. The tree line behind the pair seemed slightly off, as if the trees leaned together unnaturally, almost forming a curtain that framed a single obscure shape among them. She leaned in closer and noticed that one shadow, barely noticeable at first glance, seemed too solid, too dense to be a mere play of light. It stood in a patch of darkness, yet the rest of the forest appeared well lit, making that single area feel like a deliberate pocket of absence. The archivist blinked hard, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, but when she looked again, the shadow remained. Still vague, yes, but possessing a form that did not resemble any natural shape she could identify. It wasn't a tree trunk, nor a person, nor an animal. It felt like a silhouette with corners where no corners should exist, angles shaped by something not meant to be captured on film. A sudden draft swept through the archive room despite the windows being shut, as though the air itself had responded to her noticing something she shouldn't have. She told herself it was nothing more than a coincidence, perhaps a ventilation system kicking on after years of disrepair, but her heart quickened all the same. She turned the photograph over, hoping for a date, a name, anything to anchor it in the ordinary world, but the back was blank except for a faint smudge that looked like ink blurred long ago. Holding it up to the light revealed a strange sheen buried in the fibers of the paper, like the remnants of writing that had been intentionally rubbed out. She felt a creeping curiosity, a sensation somewhere between fascination and fear. Something about the photo demanded attention, as though it had endured decades not to be forgotten, but to be found exactly now. The archivist carefully placed it in a protective sleeve, planning to pass it along to the historians who specialized in unusual artifacts. But even after sealing it away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes of the two friends were following her. Each step she took back toward her desk felt watched, studied, as if the captured moment inside the photograph had not ended at the shutter's click but continued quietly, waiting for someone to unravel its hidden truth. The room felt colder, and a soft tap echoed somewhere behind her, perhaps just a loose piece of wood settling, but it made her spin around instinctively. Nothing was there, of course, yet her unease deepened. She glanced back at the trunk where the picture had been found and felt an odd instinctive tug, an intuitive whisper that told her the photo had not been resting quietly all these years. It felt more like it had been lying in wait, preserved too perfectly, protected by chance or by something far less ordinary. The archivist did not yet understand the significance of what she had uncovered, but the discovery of the photo marked the first ripple in a chain of events that would soon unearth a dark history hidden far beneath its innocent surface, a history that would not stay silent now that the picture had been seen again, touched again, awakened again. When the photograph reached the restoration lab, it was placed on a padded table beneath sterile white light, the kind that reveals every flaw, crease, and blemish. Historians and restoration specialists had handled hundreds of images like this before, war portraits, family gatherings, soldiers posing before deployment, yet none of them felt the peculiar heaviness this one carried. At first, it seemed like routine work: document the condition, log the notes, begin the digital scan. But the moment the image appeared on the high-resolution monitor, a hushed silence fell over the room. The smiling friends were crisp and well-defined, as expected from the photograph's oddly pristine condition, but the shadowed shape behind them looked different on the screen than it had on paper. It seemed to shift slightly each time they zoomed in, as though resisting focus, like a figure caught mid-movement in a place where no movement should be. One of the lead historians, Dr. Harland, leaned closer to the monitor, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if clearing his vision would fix what he was seeing. The image distortion around the shadow wasn't typical aging. Ordinary artifacts, scratches, dust, chemical wear leave predictable marks. But this distortion curled outward, like the edges of the shadow were bending the surrounding light. He adjusted the filters, recalibrated the contrast, experimented with spectrum isolation, yet the anomaly behaved like nothing bound to physical film. It reminded him faintly of patterns he had encountered during a previous investigation, photos linked to unexplained disappearances in the mid-20th century, cases that remained officially unsolved and unofficially whispered about among researchers who dared tread into the strange archives. Those images shared the same kind of warping, subtle enough to dismiss unless one knew what to look for. A younger assistant, Nora, pointed out that the figure's shape appeared slightly different depending on the viewing angle. When she tilted the monitor, the silhouette seemed to lengthen, its edges sharpening into an unnatural geometry that defied classification. It wasn't the form of a person, no limbs, no clear head, no variance in height, but it also wasn't a trick of shadow. It had intent in its shape, a kind of deliberate presence, as if the camera had captured something that wasn't meant to be perceived as fully material. Nora hesitated before voicing a thought she instantly regretted. It almost feels like it's looking toward the lens. The room grew quiet again. Trying to remain grounded, Harlan decided to compare the photograph with others from the same estate. There were snapshots of family gatherings, faded portraits, landscapes, all typical, all worn by time. None contained the same unnerving clarity, nor any hint of dark distortion. This only deepened the strangeness. Why was this single picture immune to decay when everything else around it had succumbed to the decades? Why did it feel like the image had been preserved by something other than careful storage? Harlan couldn't answer those questions, but he knew the next step: detailed enhancement. The team began scanning the photo at maximum resolution, layer by digital layer. At each stage, the background expanded to reveal more hidden details. The tree line behind the friends was sharper than expected. Leaves showed crisp veins, branches held their shape, yet the space containing the shadow felt like a void, swallowing all definition around it. When Nora attempted to isolate the area for further enhancement, the software glitched, freezing for several seconds before the progress bar jerked forward. When the program recovered, the shadow appeared more pronounced, more anchored, as if the digital interference had strengthened it rather than clarified it. A second historian, Emilia, recognized the pattern immediately. Her research focused on anomalous photographs from the 1930s to 1950s, images rumored to be cursed, though she hated that term. She had studied a series of portraits where a faint figure appeared near people who vanished shortly after the pictures were taken. These images were dismissed as superstition by most scholars, but Emilia had tracked disturbing correlations, names matching missing persons lists, timestamps aligning with final recorded sightings, odd distortions in the backgrounds. The shadow in this new photograph was almost identical to the one in 3 of the unsolved cases she had studied. She didn't say this aloud at first. Instead, she requested access to the archives containing the older cases, and soon she had laid out the evidence side by side. The resemblance was undeniable. The distortions were nearly perfect matches, down to the strange bending of light and the unusual clarity around the figures in the foreground. Even the way the subject smiled, stiff, almost forced, mirrored the other photos. Emilia's skin prickled as she stared at the comparison. It was as though the same unseen presence had been caught lurking behind different people across decades. The other historians watched silently, trying to rationalize what they were seeing, but their explanations grew thinner with each new detail emerging on the table. Harlan, normally a skeptic, found himself unable to dismiss the pattern. He studied the dates, 1941, 1943, 1947, and now this newly found image with no clear timestamp. Every case involved a pair or group of friends. Every case involved a disappearance with no bodies recovered. And every case included a shadowed form with the same unnatural geometry hidden in the background. It wasn't proof, not officially, but the eerie parallels were impossible to overlook. As they continued analyzing the image, the restoration lab grew unnaturally quiet. A faint hum from the fluorescent light seemed louder than usual. The air felt heavier, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Nora kept glancing at the storage cabinet, claiming she saw movement reflected in the glass, just flickers, nothing concrete, yet enough to unsettle her. Emilia felt as though the photograph had begun observing them rather than the other way around. Even Harlan struggled to remain composed, sensing that every enhancement brought them closer to uncovering something that had survived decades unseen. When they finally paused their work, the team realized that the shadowed figure in the background no longer appeared faint. It had become clearer, darker, more defined than when they began. It looked as though the act of examining it had given it form, as if attention itself fed whatever lingered inside the frozen moment of the photograph. None of them said this aloud, but they all felt it, an unspoken fear threading between them, warning that the investigation had reached beyond history, into something watching, waiting, and waking. As the historians continued their work, a sense of mounting tension settled in the lab, the kind that grows not from imagination but from patterns that can no longer be denied. Emilia, who had already compared the mysterious photograph with earlier cases, began assembling a detailed timeline on the whiteboard. The more she added, the more the room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. Each name she wrote belonged to someone who had once smiled innocently in a picture, their happiness captured in a moment that should have remained harmless. Yet every one of those individuals had vanished within weeks of being photographed, leaving no trace behind, no object, no body, no note of departure. The authorities at the time had offered explanations ranging from war-related disappearances to simple runaways, but Emilia knew better. The photographs themselves told a story the official records refused to acknowledge. When Nora pulled up archival articles, the pattern became sharper. Newspaper clippings described missing persons cases that baffled local police. In one, two sisters disappeared while walking home from the market, their last known image showing them laughing in a garden. In another, a group of college friends vanished during a weekend trip, their final photograph, taken at a riverside park, revealed a faint blur between the trees. None of the families noticed the anomaly back then, not until the disappearances became impossible to ignore. And even then, the shadow in those photos was dismissed as a flaw of old cameras. People told themselves comforting lies, because the alternative was far more frightening. Harland, who had always prided himself on approaching mysteries with logic, found his confidence beginning to crack. He spent hours examining each photograph under various filters, trying to produce a rational explanation for the distortions. But logic failed where the pattern became too consistent. The shadow in each photo was positioned at a nearly identical angle relative to the subjects, always slightly behind them, always appearing just clear enough to be recognized as the same shape. It varied in size, but its proportions never changed. It never resembled a person or an animal, nor anything formed by natural shadows. It resembled presence, not form. Something that occupied space without belonging to it. As the team mapped out the older cases, they discovered another chilling similarity. Every disappearance occurred at night, and each was preceded by a report from a neighbor or family member who recalled hearing strange, low-frequency sounds, like a deep vibration humming through walls, and glimpsing odd flickers of movement near windows. One account described a figure standing motionless beneath a street lamp, its outline jagged and wrong, vanishing the moment the witness blinked. These stories had been dismissed as fear-induced hallucinations, the kind people experience when desperately trying to make sense of something senseless. But with the evidence now laid out, the accounts finally made sense in the worst possible way. The discovery that began solidifying the pattern came from an old field journal belonging to a wartime photographer. Emilia had tracked it down in the archives after noticing the name M. Loring etched into the corner of one of the older photographs. Loring had documented soldiers, civilians, and landscapes during World War II. His writing revealed that he had noticed something strange in several of his images, an unwanted presence that appeared despite careful control of lighting and exposure. He described it as a shadow that watches, a phrase that made Emilia's hands tremble slightly when she read it aloud. Loring wrote that once he became aware of it, the shadow began appearing more often, not less. His final entry noted that he planned to destroy the photographs that contained the anomaly. Yet none of the records confirmed whether he succeeded. The journal ended abruptly, with no indication of what became of him afterward. As the historians pieced together more evidence, they noticed one final detail that tied everything together: the anomaly never appeared randomly. It only showed itself near pairs or groups bound by strong emotional connections, siblings, lovers, lifelong friends. The stronger the bond, the clearer the shadow became. It was as though it fed on connection, drawing strength from human closeness. The photograph of the two friends by the lakeside, then, was not just another coincidence. It was consistent with the entity's known pattern, marking them as its next pair. And now, by studying the photograph intensely, the team wondered if they had unknowingly contributed to awakening it, drawing its attention across decades. Nora, who had been unusually quiet, finally admitted she felt like something had changed in the room since they began linking the cases. She described a sensation of being watched, not by the people in the pictures, but by something standing behind her just beyond the edge of her vision. Harlan dismissed it at first, insisting stress could make anyone perceive things that weren't there. But when he accidentally brushed a hand against the photograph's protective sleeve, he felt an icy pulse that shot up his arm, stopping him mid-sentence. No one spoke for a long time after that. The more they traced the entity's appearances, the clearer the chronological path became. It had been photographed in 1938, then 1940, 1942, 1947, each time near people whose disappearance reports followed within days or weeks. Then nothing. No images, no sightings, no reports. It was as if the entity had gone dormant for decades, retreating into whatever realm it came from. And now, in the present, the newly discovered photograph had resurfaced. Perhaps it had never stopped watching, it had only been waiting. Waiting for someone to find it. Waiting for someone to look closely enough. Waiting for a reason to return. As the team stood around the table covered in decades-old evidence, they felt it, the unmistakable realization that the entity did not just appear in photographs. It followed them. The pattern wasn't simply historical, it was active, ongoing, and they had become part of it the moment they touched the photo, the moment they analyzed it, the moment they acknowledged its existence. And with every passing hour, the shadow in the image seemed to sharpen, as though responding to the attention, as though growing stronger, as though preparing for something that none of the previous victims had been able to escape. As the research continued, the atmosphere in the restoration lab shifted from tense curiosity to something heavier, something quietly suffocating. It began subtly, small moments that could easily be dismissed as tricks of the mind. A flicker of motion caught in a reflection, a sense of warmth draining from the room despite the heater running, the feeling of someone standing too close behind them when no one was there. Nora, usually logical and composed, was the first to admit aloud that she felt like the photograph was not just an object anymore but a presence. She reported seeing faint movements in the reflection of the glass storage cabinets, quick darts of shadow that vanished the moment she turned her head. At first, the others suggested fatigue, but deep down, they felt the same unease growing within them. One evening, as the light outside faded and the lab hummed with the faint vibration of aging machinery, Amelia stayed later than usual, determined to isolate the anomaly in the latest enhanced scan. Her eyes had grown accustomed to staring at the screen for hours, but while reviewing the image, she noticed something she could not immediately explain. The shadowy figure in the background was no longer a blur. It had a clearer outline, subtle, but unmistakable. The tree line around it appeared more compressed, as if the figure exerted pressure on the world captured within the image. It seemed to be leaning slightly forward, its form stretching in a direction it had not before. She blinked hard, stepped back, and approached again, but the shift remained. When she opened the previous scan for comparison, her stomach tightened. The change had not been her imagination. The figure had grown clearer overnight. As she prepared to call Harlan, she noticed her reflection in the monitor. Behind her, faint, almost indistinguishable, was a dark blur in the reflection of the glass door at the far end of the room. It matched the shape in the photograph. Amelia froze. She did not turn around immediately. Her breath quickened, though she tried to steady it. Slowly, she glanced over her shoulder. The door's glass showed nothing unusual now, only the dim glow of the hallway lights. It could have been a trick of light, she tried to tell herself, or the lingering image from staring at the photograph for too long. But something inside her insisted otherwise. She shut the lab down for the night far earlier than planned, though she did not mention the incident to the others until later. The next morning, as the team gathered once again, Nora arrived pale and sleep-deprived. She confessed that her dreams had turned strange. She described walking through a forest at dusk, always following the sound of whispers that came from just ahead of her, though she could never see the source. When she turned around in the dream, she always saw the same silhouette in the distance, the warped figure from the photograph, not moving, not approaching, just there, watching. She woke each time with the same sensation, that something ancient and patient had taken notice of her. Harlan tried to reassure her, insisting it was stress bleeding into her subconscious, but even he sounded unconvincing. He had slept poorly as well, plagued not by dreams but by an oppressive heaviness, as if something had pressed against his chest each time he drifted toward sleep. Later that day, when Harlan examined the image again, he noticed a detail he had somehow overlooked. In the reflection of the lake behind the two friends, a faint ripple distorted the water near their feet. It wasn't present in the earlier scans, yet it matched the curvature of a reflection, one belonging to the shadowed figure. But the reflected form appeared closer than the figure in the background, as if it had shifted position within the photograph itself. He tried to rationalize it, adjusting lighting and contrast settings, but every modification only emphasized the disturbing implication: the figure had moved. The tension in the lab grew each hour. Instruments malfunctioned more frequently, flickering lamps, freezing screens, scanners shutting down mid-process. The building's security cameras glitched, capturing brief frames of distorted static that resembled shapes more than noise. The technicians, unaware of the full story, joked nervously about the place being haunted. The historians exchanged strained glances but said nothing. They could no longer dismiss any of it. The moment that shattered any last doubts happened 3 days into the anomaly's detailed analysis. Emilia stepped away from her desk and passed by the large metal-framed window that overlooked the courtyard. She was lost in thought, replaying the comparisons of the older photos in her mind, when something caught her eye. In the faint reflection on the window's surface, just over her shoulder, she saw it, the same warped figure she had glimpsed earlier, clearer now, defined enough to distinguish its unnatural angles. Its outline bent inward, like a form that didn't quite fit the space it occupied. The breath left her body in a shaky rush. She spun around instantly, expecting, dreading, to see someone or something behind her. But the room remained empty, except for the soft hum of the equipment. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the window. This time, she told the others immediately. Harlan didn't dismiss it as imagination. Nora's face went pale. They all gathered around the photograph again, as though confronting it directly would yield answers. But instead, they noticed something new, a detail they were certain had not been there before. The eyes of the two friends looked slightly different, their gaze a touch more direct, almost aware. Harlan swore the corners of their smiles had lowered, the expression shifting ever so subtly toward something tense, something resigned. The room chilled noticeably, the temperature dropping enough that their breaths fogged faintly in front of them. None of them said it aloud, but each knew the truth that was tightening around them like an invisible noose. Whatever lingered in the photograph was no longer confined to it. It had begun to cross the fragile line between image and reality. And now that it had been noticed, truly noticed, it seemed intent on being seen everywhere, reflections, dreams, peripheral visions, like a silent acknowledgement that the historians had become part of its gaze, part of its story, and perhaps part of its next disappearance. The realization that the entity had crossed a boundary was not a sudden moment but a slow, dreadful accumulation that settled over the team like a storm cloud refusing to move. When Emilia, Harlan, and Nora gathered in the lab the following morning, none of them had slept more than a few scattered minutes. The exhaustion was visible in their eyes, but so was fear, the quiet, deep-rooted kind that comes when logic finally surrenders to the impossible. They no longer questioned the reality of what they were facing. The question now was what the entity wanted, and why it had remained dormant for decades only to reawaken the moment the photograph was touched again. Harlan was the first to suggest that perhaps the entity was tied not to the people in the photograph, but to the act of observation itself. Each time historians or archivists had discovered similar images across the decades, disappearances followed. It wasn't the subjects who triggered the phenomenon, it was the viewers, the ones who unknowingly invited the presence closer by trying to expose it. He theorized that the entity fed on attention, emerging only when observed, growing stronger the more it was analyzed, questioned, and feared. This theory made the old cases click into place, chilling everyone in the room. The entity had been dormant for so long because no one had seen the photograph, no one had given it the awareness it needed to stir. But now, every enhancement, every scan, every moment they spent staring at the image had awakened it inch by inch. Nora supported the theory with her own frightening experiences. She claimed that every night, the dreams grew more vivid. She now found herself standing not just in the forest, but right at the edge of the lake from the photograph. The two friends always stood ahead of her, motionless, their backs turned. And behind them, in the tree line, the figure loomed, no longer distant and indistinct, but sharp and enormous, as if it were stepping closer each time she dreamed. She described how the trees bent unnaturally around it, curving inward like ribs forming a cage. The whispers she heard were louder now, layered voices echoing in a language she couldn't understand. Every time she woke up, she was certain the whispers lingered in the air for a brief moment before dissolving into silence. Emilia had begun hearing faint sounds as well, but in waking hours, not in dreams. While working alone in the lab, she would hear soft tapping, like fingers brushing against glass, coming from the direction of the storage cabinet where the photograph was kept. Once, when standing near the cabinet, she felt a cold breath sweep across the back of her neck. She jerked around expecting someone to be there, but she was alone. The air was still except for a slow, steady hum that did not belong to any machine. When she pressed her ear against the cabinet door, she heard it clearly, a low rumbling, almost like a heartbeat or a distant engine, pulsing steadily from inside the thin space where the photograph rested. She said nothing at first, hoping it was simply a malfunctioning appliance, but the sound continued even when the lab's power briefly went out. The photograph had begun producing its own vibrations. Meanwhile, Harlan's encounters were subtler but no less disturbing. He noticed that the figure in the photograph now cast a faint reflection on the lake's surface, a reflection distinctly darker than the earlier scans. He measured its position carefully and found that the reflection's proximity to the two friends was shrinking with each passing day. The entity was moving. Not just shifting shape, moving. He documented the changes meticulously, but with each new detail his dread deepened. He knew that once the figure reached the friend's reflection, the photograph's frozen moment would no longer be frozen. It would be a scene in progress, something unfolding rather than captured. And if that happened, whatever occurred next inside the photograph would no longer remain confined to its boundaries. The team now faced an impossible crossroads. Destroying the photograph seemed like an obvious solution, but Emilia warned against it. In the cases she studied, several families had attempted to burn or tear the images linked to disappearances. Their notes, preserved in archived letters, described horrific outcomes. In nearly every case, the individuals who destroyed the photos vanished within hours. It was as if the entity reacted violently to attempts at severing its connection. Some descriptions were more chilling: shadows spreading across walls, sudden drops in temperature, a final flicker of movement caught in a mirror before the person was gone. If the entity was now aware of the historians, destroying the photo could provoke a direct attack rather than containing it. Keeping the photograph was equally dangerous. Every hour it grew stronger. Their constant focus on it had sharpened the figure, empowered it. The lab had become a conduit, a threshold through which something ancient and hungry was slipping. They debated sealing the image away in a secure vault, burying it deep within the archives, but Nora argued that the entity was not bound by distance. It had already crossed into their reflections, their dreams. Moving the physical object would not stop the presence that now followed them like a shadow tied to their very awareness. The discussions grew increasingly desperate. They searched through historical records, folklore, obscure journals, anything that might hint at how previous victims had survived. But none of them did. Every trace of the entity's past encounters ended with disappearance, silence, and unanswered questions. The pattern was absolute. No one had ever escaped its attention once it had fixed its gaze on them. As the hours passed, the lab grew darker, as though the shadows in the corners had thickened. The building's lights flickered rhythmically, the vibrations in the cabinet grew louder, and the air took on a biting cold. The photograph, now displayed on the screen, seemed different again. The two friends' expressions had changed entirely, their smiles gone, replaced with something strained, hollow, as if they sensed the entity behind them. And behind them, the figure stood inches closer, its edges sharper, its form towering, its presence almost pushing outward from the image. The team realized then that they were running out of time. Their investigation had gone too deep. Their attention had been too focused. And the entity, long dormant, was no longer content to remain within the frame. It was reaching through the photograph now, stretching across the thinning boundary, drawn not by the friends in the image, but by the living minds that had awakened it. The historians had become the newest link in a chain spanning generations, a pattern of curiosity and terror that had repeated throughout history. And now, as the room dimmed and the figure in the photograph appeared almost ready to step forward, they knew with a chilling certainty that the entity's next disappearance would not be documented in old archives, it would be their own. As the final pieces of the truth fell into place, the weight of the past pressed heavily on everyone involved, as if the air itself had thickened with the remnants of long-buried dread. The photograph, just a small, grainy square of faded paper, had become an artifact powerful enough to tear open a century-old wound. What had once been dismissed as an innocent snapshot of two friends now revealed itself to be a silent witness to betrayal, sacrifice, and a darkness that had never entirely lifted from the village. When the last historian stepped back from the magnified print, trembling slightly, the implications of what they had uncovered settled over the room like settling dust. Every shadow, every blurred background shape, every strained expression suddenly aligned with a narrative that no one had dared to imagine. The discovery was not just historical, it was personal, haunting, a thread that connected strangers across generations through the chilling truth of what had happened on that forgotten afternoon. The villagers who had survived long enough to hear about the discovery responded with a mix of fear and resignation, as though they always suspected the past would claw its way back into the present. Some whispered that disturbing old truths was dangerous, that the dead preferred to remain undisturbed. Others seemed almost relieved, as if an invisible burden had finally been lifted, allowing them to breathe freely after decades of inherited silence. But regardless of their reactions, the photograph's revelation changed the atmosphere of the town forever. Streets that once bustled with quiet routine felt charged with an eerie awareness. Families who thought they knew their ancestors now questioned what else had been hidden, and who among them might still carry secrets born from the same darkness. The two friends in the picture, long gone, long forgotten by most, took on new life through the rediscovered tale. Their expressions, once interpreted as playful or casual, now seemed heavy with unspoken knowledge, their eyes holding reflections of something just outside the frame. Historians debated feverishly, theories branching out like tangled roots. Some argued the friends had been victims, caught in circumstances beyond their control. Others insisted they were complicit in the catastrophic events that followed. The uncertainty became part of the story's power, a reminder that history was rarely clean or absolute, and that the truth often lived in shadows, half-formed and shifting. As reports of the rediscovered secret spread beyond the village, the photograph became both a curiosity and a warning. Scholars traveled great distances to examine it, journalists wrote sensationalized articles that only half captured the real weight of the discovery, and researchers speculated about what else might still lie hidden in archives, waiting for willing or unwilling eyes. Yet, no matter how many people analyzed it, the image retained its unsettling aura. It seemed to absorb attention, drawing observers into the unsettling possibility that the darkness it captured was not confined to the past. Some who spent hours studying it reported strange discomfort, a feeling of being watched, or a sense that something in the image shifted when they weren't looking directly at it. None of these observations could be proven, of course, but whispers spread, lending the photograph an almost supernatural infamy. Eventually, the findings were compiled into a comprehensive record, preserving every detail uncovered by the historians. But even as the documentation grew, the story felt unfinished. Too many elements remained unexplained, too many contradictions refused to settle into place. The discovery had illuminated a portion of the truth, but it also cast deeper shadows across areas still obscured. The historians who had started the investigation found themselves unsettled by this lack of finality. Instead of closing the chapter, the photograph had opened a corridor of unanswered questions, pulling them deeper into mysteries they had never expected to confront. In the weeks that followed, subtle but undeniable changes occurred around the village. Objects went missing and later reappeared in places they didn't belong. Lights flickered in buildings that hadn't had electrical issues in decades. Residents felt cold spots in rooms despite warm weather. More than one person reported seeing faint silhouettes where no one should have been, fleeting impressions of figures standing side by side, watching quietly from a distance. Most dismissed these moments as tricks of the mind, the natural result of stirring up eerie history. But a small handful couldn't shake the feeling that the two friends, or something connected to them, had awakened after being acknowledged again. The historians, too, experienced their share of strange occurrences. Paper shuffled on their own as though touched by a draft that didn't exist. Audio recordings captured faint sounds that resembled whispers. Even the photograph itself seemed different each time they examined it, as if its grain shifted, its shadows deepened, its subject somehow more aware. Rational explanations were offered, but none truly satisfied the unease that grew quietly among those who had spent the most time with the image. It was as if the photograph, having finally revealed its secret, now demanded something in return: attention, remembrance, or perhaps acknowledgement of debts long unpaid. Despite the unease, the photograph was eventually sealed behind protective glass and displayed in a local exhibit dedicated to the town's history. People visited out of curiosity or fascination, drawn by the chilling reputation the artifact had developed. Some left quickly, unsettled by the uneasy stillness of the image, while others lingered, as if the photograph held a magnetic pull. Among the visitors were descendants of those connected to the original events, searching for some understanding of their own heritage. Many left with more questions than answers, sensing a connection they couldn't fully explain. But the story didn't end with the exhibit. Late one night, long after the museum had closed, the guards reported hearing footsteps echoing through the dark halls. When they investigated, the sound vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. One guard, braver or more curious than the others, paused in front of the photograph. Though he couldn't articulate why, he felt that the two figures in the picture looked different, closer together, their expressions altered, their eyes sharper. A chill ran up his spine, and he stepped back without understanding exactly what had changed. In the end, the photograph remained a mystery that refused to settle. It held its secret tightly, revealing just enough to unsettle but never enough to provide true closure. And as the years passed, as more people encountered the image and added their own speculations to the growing lore, one truth became undeniable: the photograph was no longer just a relic of history. It had become a living reminder of the past's ability to reach forward, casting its shadow across the present, waiting patiently for the next pair of eyes brave, or foolish, enough to look too closely.